The hidden shadows unmasking evil in the heart of America. In the very fabric of America's vibrant streets where prosperity and diversity intertwine, darkness often lurks in the most unsuspecting corners. It's a tale that cuts deep into the country's collective conscience, two devastating crimes, each a reflection of humanity's capacity for cruelty and selfishness. One, a meticulously planned kidnapping that mirrors a chilling blueprint of control and greed. The other, a tragic domestic nightmare, where love once professed transforms into a cacophony of pain and horror. These incidents aren't just stories, they are sharp, unflinching alarms that reverberate across a nation grappling with both its promises and its failings. They compel us to confront the uncomfortable truths we dare not voice at the dinner table or during polite conversations. How can such atrocities transpire in a land celebrated for its ideals of freedom, justice, and the pursuit of happiness? The United States has often played protagonist on the global stage, a shining city on a hill, embodying progress and innovation. But just like the contradictions found in classic Americana, where a bustling metropolis thrives beside a shadowed alley, this nation has spaces where its light fails to reach. Behind closed doors and in the vanishing shadows of towering skyscrapers, broken promises lay scattered, and the sinister whispers of violence, greed, and ambition seep into lives unsuspecting. This narrative isn't just another statistic filed away in law enforcement's archives, it's a panorama of fears, resilience, and moral questions. What does justice look like in these scenarios? What responsibilities does society hold to safeguard its most vulnerable? In this journey, we delve deep into two stark tales of horror, one set amidst the sprawling, electrified chaos of New York and another nestled within the intimate confines of a Texan household. They serve as stark reminders of what happens when cruelty is allowed to go unchecked, and where the line between humanity and monstrosity can so easily blur. These cautionary tales test our sense of societal structure, begging us not to passively observe but to challenge everything from systemic flaws to individual acts of complicity. Rooted in these narratives is a universal plea to reclaim empathy, to demand justice, and to believe that hope can still emerge even from the darkest of nights. The New York kidnapping, a chilling ordeal in the heart of the city. It began like countless ordinary days in New York City, the subway cars rattling through tunnels, the honking chaos of traffic, and the hurried footsteps of millions chasing their dreams in the city that never sleeps. But for Sophie, a bright and ambitious college student hailing from a wealthy family, April 3rd would forever mark the day her life took a horrifying turn. Sophie was not just any young woman, she was charismatic, studious, and well-loved among her peers. However, her privileged lifestyle and regular routines made her a carefully chosen target for a criminal enterprise that thrived on planning and precision. For weeks, a shadowy group had been trailing her, watching her every move with cold calculation, waiting for the perfect moment to pounce. They were no ordinary criminals. This was a professional group specializing in high-profile kidnappings, each member with a critical skill set: surveillance, abduction, negotiation, and enforcement. Their mission was ruthless and singular: extract a ransom worth millions. The plan took shape with surgical precision. Posing as blue-collar workers on a construction site, the group mapped out Sophie's daily route, from her college campus in the Upper West Side to her luxurious family townhouse near Central Park. The leader of the group, a man known only by the alias Vince, orchestrated every step. Vince was no stranger to crime, but his true weapon was his ability to manipulate people under pressure, transforming fear into compliance. On that fateful afternoon, Sophie left her campus library a little later than usual, her bag slung over one shoulder, headphones in place. This seemingly ordinary exit would lead her directly into the trap set by her captors. As she crossed a less crowded street near her regular route, a utility van, painted with false logos, screeched to a stop beside her. Before she could react, two masked figures lunged out, grabbing her while muffling her screams with tape. The entire scene was over in less than 20 seconds, unnoticed by passers-by caught up in their own busyness. Sophie had vanished into the underbelly of New York, leaving a single backpack behind as the only clue to her whereabouts. The crime sent shockwaves through her family and local law enforcement. Being no stranger to wealth, Sophie's father, Henry Reeves, a prominent businessman, immediately hired private investigators while reporting the matter to the FBI. It wasn't long before the kidnappers reached out, their demands bared to Henry through a chilling voice modifier over the phone: $1 million in cash. Any deviation or delay, they warned, would result in the permanent disappearance of his beloved daughter. Meanwhile, Sophie's life had turned into an absolute nightmare. She was held captive in a dilapidated warehouse on the outskirts of the city, a place so remote that even the sound of her protests echoed only to hollow walls. Her captors treated her as collateral damage, refusing her basic needs, physically intimidating her, and subjecting her to mental torment. Days passed. She was deprived of proper meals, tied to a chair for hours, and taunted with threats of execution. For Sophie, the line between hope and despair grew thinner with each passing moment. The FBI launched an aggressive investigation, employing cutting-edge technology and the skills of seasoned negotiation experts to track the kidnappers down. Using triangulations from burner phones, surveillance camera footage, and even recognizing patterns in the kidnappers' language, the pieces of the puzzle came slowly but surely together. Time, however, was not on their side. The ultimate breakthrough came when an undercover agent, posing as the money courier, managed to get close enough to one of the accomplices during the ransom exchange. This opened the door for a daring rescue operation in the dead of night. SWAT teams coordinated with FBI units to raid the abandoned warehouse. Within moments, gunfire erupted between the authorities and a desperate Vince, who refused to surrender without a fight. One by one, his accomplices were subdued, and Sophie, though physically weak and emotionally scarred, was pulled from her chains and rushed to safety. While Vince and his team were captured and sentenced to lengthy prison terms, the scars of Sophie's ordeal lingered far beyond the legal resolutions. Her story became a rallying cry against unchecked urban crimes, resonating with families who have felt the fragility of safety in a nation's most populated city. She would later recount her tale in a memoir, describing not only the horrors of captivity, but also the strength she found within herself to endure. New York City, as always, continued to bustle with life. Yet for those who heard Sophie's story, her harrowing experience was a stark reminder of how darkness can loom in even the brightest cities. A wicked plan and sophisticated tactics. At the heart of the kidnapping plan was a ruthless criminal organization led by a mastermind known only as Vince. A man with a cold demeanor and a Machiavellian mind, Vince thrived on precision, intimidation, and control. To him, every job was a chess game, a calculated series of moves designed to ensure victory with minimal risk. This particular operation would be no different. The group comprised 5 individuals, each hand-picked for their unique skills and experience. Among them was a surveillance expert who could crack the digital trail of their target using cameras, social media, and even small behavioral patterns. There was also the logistics manager, a man responsible for securing hideouts, vehicles, and disguises. The muscle of the team consisted of 2 enforcers, physically imposing figures trained in subduing and intimidating victims. Vince himself not only served as the leader but also the negotiator, specializing in psychological manipulation to bend his victim or their families to his will. Together, they represented a criminal unit as methodical as it was merciless. Their target, Sophie, was selected not by chance but after meticulous consideration. She fit the profile Vince had relied on for years: young, affluent, with family resources to pay a sizable ransom in cash. Sophie's movements were studied for weeks before the operation commenced. Every class schedule, every coffee stop, and every walk home from the library was noted. The criminal team needed to know not just where Sophie would be, but who might notice if she disappeared. In Vince's own twisted logic, the better he planned her abduction, the smoother the process for everyone involved, except, of course, for the victim. The plan was staged into 3 distinct phases. The first phase, observation, was pure reconnaissance. One member of the group spent 11 days embedded as a street vendor near Sophie's campus, while another posed as a jogger in her neighborhood. These individuals blended flawlessly into Sophie's environment, taking photos of her movements and committing small details to memory, such as her habit of listening to music while walking, and the tendency to glance at her phone while crossing the street. The simple elegance of these observations would later prove pivotal to their strategy. Phase 2, known as integration, revolved around creating the illusion of normalcy as they proceeded to prepare their tools of the trade. A plain white van was outfitted with fake company decals reading City Repair Services. Masks, zip ties, duct tape, and disposable gloves were purchased separately from stores across several boroughs. Vince knew that small purchases from different locations would minimize the chance of leaving behind a noticeable trail. Even the burner phones used for future communication were obtained through a black market source that specialized in outfitting criminal networks. For this team, every detail was an insurance policy against failure. The third and final phase, execution, was meticulously timed. Vince chose a specific Tuesday afternoon, a time when Sophie typically walked home from the library, and the area was at its quietest. Two members positioned themselves in the van, while the others waited nearby to intercept if anything went wrong. Everyone was dressed as construction workers to provide a visual excuse if they aroused suspicion. Vince anticipated every variable down to the weather forecast, ensuring their actions didn't stand out against the city's natural rhythm. When the plan was executed, it was a flawless yet chilling display of efficiency. The van screeched to a halt beside Sophie at just the right moment, and the enforcers moved with a speed and precision honed through countless rehearsals. Sophie was grabbed and subdued in under 20 seconds, silenced with tape before she could scream, and shoved into the back of the van as though she had simply vanished. The bag she dropped on the sidewalk was left intentionally. It would serve as both a breadcrumb for investigators and a cruel reminder for her family that she had been taken. Once she was in their custody, the team immediately transitioned to their secondary hideout, switching cars and dumping the van in a nondescript parking lot to avoid detection. The warehouse they had prepared was grim, dark and isolated, with cold concrete walls and no chance of escape. Vince believed in keeping his captives terrified yet alive. In his mind, fear was a tool for compliance and leverage. The entire operation demonstrated a level of criminal sophistication that sent chills down the spines of even seasoned FBI investigators. What stood out most was the cold, calculated efficiency with which Sophie was reduced to nothing more than a pawn in a ransom negotiation. Her kidnappers didn't see her humanity. To them, she was simply a paycheck waiting to be collected. The entire plan, wicked and intricate, revealed an unnerving truth about the perpetrators. They were not driven by desperation, but by greed and a cold sense of professional pride in their ability to carry out the perfect crime. But even the most flawless plans can unravel, as Vince and his team would soon discover. The wealthy father held hostage by ransom. The news broke like thunder in the Reeves household. One moment Henry Reeves was locked in an afternoon of high-stakes conference calls at his sleek, glass-walled office in Midtown Manhattan. The next he was sitting in his mahogany-clad study clutching his phone as the cold, distorted voice on the other end delivered the unthinkable. "We have your daughter." Henry Reeves was not a man easily shaken. As the CEO of a billion-dollar real estate empire, he had spent decades cultivating a reputation as a stoic, sharp-witted businessman who could negotiate his way through the most cutthroat deals. But in that moment, every ounce of his wealth and power felt meaningless. All that mattered was Sophie, his only child, the light of his life. The voice on the phone wasted no time, an emotionless, mechanical distortion that slithered through the room like a snake. $1 million, in cash, small bills. Do not contact the police. If you try anything, your daughter disappears forever. For a man accustomed to commanding boardrooms, this was a foreign kind of terror. Powerless, Henry could barely process the reality of what was happening. His vision blurred as the kidnapper delivered instructions. The money was to be packed in duffel bags and dropped at a location to be revealed later. They assured him that Sophie was alive, for now, but punctuated their message with chilling clarity. Any deviation or delay spelled her end. The call ended with an abrupt click, leaving Henry to stare at the silent phone, his mind racing. The immaculate world he had built for his family, a world of privilege, security, and comfort, had been shattered in an instant. A father's desperation. For Henry, the hours that followed were a blur of panic and resolve. He summoned his team of high-profile attorneys and private security experts, demanding immediate action. But even as these trusted advisors scrambled to determine the best course forward, Henry knew there was only one option. Sophie had to come home, no matter the cost. While he meticulously prepared to comply with the ransom demand, he also realized this was too large a threat for him to handle alone. Despite the kidnapper's explicit warning, Henry contacted the authorities. The gravity of the situation demanded it. Within hours, the FBI was in his office, their presence almost invisible, plain clothes, discreet movements, and subdued voices. It was clear that this was not their first encounter with a case like this. Special Agent Claire Monroe, the lead investigator, approached Henry with a demeanor of steady confidence. She studied every word of the ransom call, cataloging details that could be vital in tracking the kidnappers. The voice modulation, the time of day, the specific phrasing. To her, each element suggested a high level of criminal sophistication. "What you're dealing with, Mr. Reeves," Agent Monroe explained, isn't just an opportunist. This is probably an organized group, precise, methodical, and ruthless. They know exactly who you are and what you can pay. But no matter how skilled they think they are, every plan leaves traces, and we'll find them. Henry clung desperately to Monroe's words, but doubt lingered. The kidnappers had been chillingly specific. Any police involvement would endanger Sophie's life. Could he really trust that this calculated risk wouldn't push the criminals into a desperate act? A race against time. As the days ticked by, the pressure mounted. The clock was Henry's ultimate enemy. The kidnappers sent brutal reminders of their power, calling sporadically to demand updates or offer grim taunts. At one point, a distorted voice whispered, "Just remember, Mr. Reeves, she's running out of days." The FBI launched a relentless investigation, analyzing everything from the voice distortions used on the phone calls to the drop-offs specified in ransom notes. Specialists dissected the burner phones used to make the calls, tracing what little digital footprint they could find. Surveillance footage from the vicinity of Sophie's abduction was scrutinized frame by frame, revealing shadowy figures and unidentified vehicles. Each discovery, each fragment of evidence, gave Henry a sliver of fleeting hope. Inside his apartment, Henry's life was consumed by his daughter's absence. He barely slept, barely ate. Nights stretched endlessly as he sat alone in the dim glow of his living room, staring at Sophie's childhood photos and replaying her laughter in his mind. His wealth, which once felt like a shield, now felt like a target painted on his back. Though he was surrounded by agents and advisors, Henry had never felt more isolated. Sophie wasn't just his daughter, she was his anchor. Her curiosity, her drive, she was everything he had hoped to pass on. And now she was somewhere out there, suffering, maybe even wondering if he'd failed her. The thought was unbearable. The final gamble. The kidnappers' demands culminated in a planned exchange. One final call, one precise location, one perilous moment. The FBI encouraged Henry to follow through with the ransom, but under strict surveillance. Special Agent Monroe reminded him, "This is our shot. We have eyes everywhere. If they show up, we'll have them. And if they try to harm your daughter, we'll stop them before they can." The exchange was staged in grim secrecy. Henry arrived at an abandoned parking garage in the dead of night, his hands gripping the duffel bags stuffed with cash. He could feel the weight, not of the money, but of Sophie's life. He set the bags down as instructed and stepped back, his heart pounding as he waited for some proof of her safety. What happened next would go down as one of the most harrowing moments of Henry's life. The kidnappers, who had been watching from a distance, approached cautiously. However, their movements were shadowed by FBI agents who had been quietly triangulating their location. The ensuing moments unfolded in a blur of chaos, figures darting into the dark, a tense standoff of split-second decisions, and finally a raid that unearthed Sophie's location. Ultimately, Henry's gamble, and the FBI's precision planning, paid off. Sophie was rescued from her grim captivity, her body frail but her spirit intact. As she was pulled into her father's arms, Henry felt an overwhelming surge of relief, though the weight of trauma still loomed heavy. The aftermath. Though the kidnappers were arrested and sentenced, the ordeal left scars that no trial could erase. Henry Reeves became an unexpected advocate for victims' rights, channeling his resources into causes that focused on preventing abductions and supporting families caught in the same nightmare he had endured. To Henry, no amount of wealth could erase the fragile line between power and vulnerability. It was Sophie herself who reminded him of the most important truth. Even in the darkest moments, the love of a parent could outlast anything. The victim in hell, both physically and mentally abused. For Sophie, the first moments of captivity blurred into a panicked haze. The cold grip of her captor's hands, the suffocating darkness of a blindfold, and the muffled sounds of the city she'd once felt so safe in, it all dissipated as she realized she was completely at the mercy of strangers. Fear surged in waves, but it was only the beginning. The nightmare she'd been thrust into would reach depths she could have never imagined. The grim warehouse where Sophie was held became her prison, its towering concrete walls seeming to absorb her desperation and bury her cries. The place was bare, a space drained of any warmth, soaked instead in the chill of decay and neglect. A single chair sat bolted to the floor, which soon became her anchor. It wasn't there as a convenience, it was a tool, a device to keep her immobilized, both physically and mentally. Her captors moved with precision. They knew exactly how to break her from the inside out. Their tactics were not wild or thoughtless. This was not an impulsive crime carried out in the heat of emotion. Instead, It was calculated evil, woven into a tapestry of psychological and physical torment that stretched Sophie's spirit to its very limits. The physical brutality. Her days were marked by the bruising grip of hands that shoved her into corners, the coarse tape that tore at her skin whenever it was ripped from her mouth, and the cold pressure of restraints that dug deeper into her wrists and ankles with every minor movement. The warehouse wasn't just a prison, it was a torture chamber designed to strip her of her dignity. The kidnappers fed Sophie just enough to keep her alive but not enough to give her strength. Meals were cold scraps of food thrown carelessly onto the floor. Water came in small plastic bottles that she had to balance precariously on her chained hands just to take a sip. They deprived her of sleep intentionally, shouting or clanging against walls whenever she began to drift off. Hours blurred into days, and Sophie's body grew weaker, her muscles aching from the prolonged exhaustion and constant tension of her restraints. Every act of defiance, no matter how small, like turning her face away during their taunts, was met with swift punishment. Her captors would tighten her bonds, yelling insults that echoed in the hollow space, each word a reminder that here she had no agency, no voice, and no control. They wanted her worn down, her body fragile, and her mind broken. Her hands were swollen from the ropes that held her, her legs trembling from the lack of movement. Even when they untied her briefly to give her a moment's reprieve, it wasn't to show mercy. It was only so they could shove her back into the chair with renewed force, an act meant to re-establish their absolute dominance. "She's just collateral," one of them remarked during her rare moments of lucidity, a comment meant to remind her of her reduced humanity. To them, Sophie wasn't a woman with dreams, a family, or a story. She was nothing more than leverage for a larger payday. The mental torment. But it wasn't just Sophie's body that bore the onslaught, it was her mind that suffered the heaviest blows. The captors were masters at playing with her psychology, systematically unraveling her resilience. They made sure every second of her life in captivity was steeped in fear and uncertainty. They deliberately disoriented her by giving no sense of time. The windows of the warehouse were boarded up, and her blindfolds rarely came off. Was it morning? Evening? Another day lost in an endless cycle of torment? She had no way to tell. They played music at odd hours, loud bursts of distorted soundtracks that jarred her awake when she tried to steal moments of rest. Darkness was her constant companion, interrupted only by the blinding sharpness of a flashlight when one of her captors appeared. The threats poured from their mouths like venom, laced with imagery that painted detailed and horrifying pictures. They promised her a slow, painful death if things didn't go as planned. Each word worked like a scalpel, carving away at her courage, her composure, her sanity. "What do you think they'll say about you when we're done?" one captor sneered one evening, his breath hot against her ear. "That the golden girl of the Reeves family begged and cried just like anyone else?" Worse still were the moments of silence. When the captors left her alone in the vast emptiness of the warehouse, Sophie was haunted by her own thoughts. Had she been abandoned? Would anyone find her before it was too late? Each scream she let out echoed back in mockery, swallowed whole by the walls around her. Her past life, the one filled with lectures, coffee dates with friends, and walks along the park, felt like it had belonged to a different person entirely. The bubbly college student Sophie Reeves was no longer. What was left was a shell, cracking under the strain of hopelessness, the thin line between hope and despair. And yet, somehow deep within her, Sophie clung to fragments of hope. There were nights when her tears finally dried and her breathing calmed. In those moments of clarity, she reminded herself of her family's love. She imagined her father's booming laugh, her mother's warm hugs, and the hope that someone, somewhere, was out there fighting for her. Sophie began to silently count numbers in her head, a meditative practice to ground herself when her captors intensified their attack on her psyche. She observed subtle things like the sound of passing trucks outside the warehouse or the smell of damp concrete. They were meaningless details, but they gave her mind something to latch onto, something to focus on besides the horror. Every so often a flicker of defiance emerged. Though physically weakened, Sophie refused to let them crush her spirit entirely. She wouldn't let them win, and if there was anything left to hold on to, it was that flicker, faint but unbroken. The hell they created for Sophie, captivity was defined by unbearable pain, the erasure of her identity, and the cruel indifference of her captors. She'd entered their world unwillingly, a pawn in their twisted game, yet she refused to lose touch with the person she had been before they took her. They didn't know that her resilience, fragile as it seemed, still burned beneath the surface. They couldn't take everything. They couldn't erase her humanity, no matter how hard they tried to grind it into the floor of that awful warehouse. What her captors didn't realize was this: while they crafted hell, Sophie crafted survival. The FBI intervenes, a race against time. When Henry Reeves called the FBI, it wasn't just an act of desperation, it was a gamble with the highest stakes. He knew he was going against the kidnapper's explicit warning. The chilling voice had been clear: any involvement of law enforcement and Sophie would be gone forever. But deep down, Henry understood there was no other way. The clock was ticking, and he needed professionals, people who had stared into the abyss of organized crime before and emerged victorious. Within hours, a quiet, calculating presence filled Henry's luxurious Manhattan penthouse. Agents in civilian clothing arrived with minimal fanfare, moving like shadows through the corridors of his home. This wasn't a team of movie-style detectives bursting through doors with guns in hand. This was the FBI's elite crisis response unit, structured, strategic, and calm in the face of chaos. Special Agent Claire Monroe took the lead. She was steady, unshaken, and had the kind of no-nonsense confidence that came from years of experience dealing with high-stakes ransom situations. Dressed simply in a tailored suit and flats, Monroe projected a sense of control that steadied Henry's fraying nerves at least for a moment. "We're dealing with professionals, Mr. Reeves," Monroe began, her calm tone cutting through the tension in the room. She'd already gone over the recordings of the ransom calls several times. "This isn't their first crime, and it likely won't be their last, unless we find them. These perpetrators plan their actions with military precision, and they'll expect us to falter. But what they don't know is that we're already inside their process. Every plan leaves behind breadcrumbs. What we need now is time to follow them." The operation commences. The FBI's first move was to establish a command center in Henry's penthouse, a temporary headquarters complete with computers, phone tracking software, and real-time analysts. A communication protocol was set up so that when the kidnappers called again, every word, every pause, and every sound in the background would be dissected for even the smallest clues. The technology was state-of-the-art, but as Monroe liked to say, machines help solve crimes, but it's people who catch criminals. The first big lead came when the FBI analyzed the call. The voice-altering software used by the kidnappers was advanced, but not flawless. Buried beneath the distortion, audio engineers detected subtle background noise, sounds of trucks rumbling, footsteps on gravel. Monroe's team identified this as a possible industrial area. It wasn't much, but it was a start. From there, the operation went into overdrive. 1. The kidnappers had used a burner phone to make their demands, but the FBI didn't take this at face value. Analysts worked round the clock to trace the phone's origin down to the store it had been purchased from. Surveillance footage from nearby stores gave them their first glimpse of a man they suspected was part of the team. Mid-40s, lean, wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his face. 2. Investigators began combing through New York's vast web of security cameras, triangulating the general location of the burner phone's signal. New York City may be a metropolis of chaos, but to the FBI, every block had a story to tell. Monroe had a saying: criminals can't disappear, they just think they can. 3. The kidnappers' scripted ransom messages hinted at their expertise. Phrases like "we have your daughter" and "she disappears forever" were matter-of-fact, devoid of emotion, clearly rehearsed. Linguists and profilers immediately began building a psychological profile from their choice of words: pragmatic, businesslike, and entirely devoid of personal sentiment. This helped the FBI confirm they were likely dealing with a professional kidnapping for ransom group. Pressure builds. As days turned into nights, Henry Reeves felt like he was losing his grip. Despite the FBI's steady progress, the fact remained that Sophie was still missing. The kidnappers kept calling, each time layering their demands with more urgency. One call stood out. The kidnapper, using his distorted voice, whispered a chilling threat. "You're running out of time, Reeves. Do you love your daughter? Prove it, or she's gone." Monroe never flinched. After the call, the room went silent as her team replayed it repeatedly. Her leadership inspired confidence, but even she couldn't predict how close the FBI was cutting it. The weight on Henry, seeing his child used as a bargaining chip, was becoming unbearable. Meanwhile, Sophie's location remained elusive. Though the FBI had narrowed their search to a gritty industrial section of Queens, the area was vast, with countless abandoned warehouses, storage units, and scrapyards. Monroe recognized that time wasn't just slipping away, it was sprinting. Her team turned up their efforts, mobilizing ground units while trying to avoid alerting the kidnappers. The breakthrough. It was an unexpected stroke of luck that tipped the balance. During a routine scan of nearby cameras, one of Monroe's agents flagged a suspicious van parked near a construction site. The logo on the van, City Repair Services, matched a false company name flagged in their database of possible fronts. Surveillance footage showed the van entering the industrial area at odd hours, always avoiding main roads. Monroe's instincts kicked in. "Get a team out there," she ordered. "I want eyes on every building within a 2-block radius." The operation became a whirlwind of activity. Undercover agents were dispatched to surveil the area, using drones and night vision cameras to scout for suspicious activity. A suspicious pattern emerged, encrypted messages being sent from one of the buildings closest to the van's last sighting. Monroe decided it was finally time to act. The high-stakes raid. The raid was orchestrated in complete secrecy. SWAT teams, along with Monroe's specialized agents, surrounded the suspected warehouse under the cover of darkness. Tactical precision was key. The kidnappers were armed and desperate, and above all, Sophie's safety was their #1 priority. At exactly 2:47 a.m., the agents stormed the building. Flashbang grenades shattered the suffocating silence, briefly disorienting the captors. Chaos erupted as bullets ricocheted off metal and concrete. Vince, the leader, attempted a daring escape, but Monroe's team was ready. Within minutes, he and his accomplices were subdued, cuffed, and dragged into waiting vehicles. Sophie was found chained to a chair in a corner of the warehouse. Her body was frail, her face gaunt, but she was alive. When the agents freed her from the restraints, she broke down in tears, a mix of relief and lingering terror gripping her as she realized the nightmare was finally over. The cost of survival. Monroe held a press briefing shortly after the operation's success. "We never gave up on Sophie," she said, exhaustion evident in her voice. "This was a race against the clock, but we did what we came to do." For Sophie, however, the battle wasn't over. The emotional and physical scars of her captivity would remain. But thanks to the FBI's tireless effort, she was reunited with her father, a man who came dangerously close to losing the one person who mattered more than anything in his world. For Henry, the experience reframed everything. His wealth and power, once the source of his pride, now felt hollow compared to the life of his daughter. And for Monroe and her team, it was another day in the uniquely demanding, emotionally charged profession of standing between order and chaos. The harrowing rescue operation. It was the moment the FBI had been racing toward. After days of following whispers, tracing leads, and teetering on the edge of despair, they had their target, the warehouse where Sophie was being held. The industrial area of Queens, with its shadowy alleyways and towering stacks of rusted metal, had provided the perfect hiding spot for the kidnappers, but time had betrayed them. The FBI, armed with certainty and determination, was ready to strike. The operation unfolded in the dead of night. Special Agent Claire Monroe huddled her tactical officers and SWAT team beneath the cover of darkness, just blocks from the building in question. The street was eerily silent, broken only by the occasional rumble of a truck in the distance. Monroe, a pillar of calm authority, stepped forward and addressed her team. "We go in fast. We go in clean. We leave no room for error," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the low hum of tension. "Sophie Reeves is our priority. No civilian casualties. No loose ends. Let's bring her home." The team nodded in unison, their faces set with steely determination. They knew the risks. The kidnappers were not amateurs, they were armed, desperate, and had nothing to lose. But the haunting specter of Sophie, chained, terrified, possibly on the brink of death, drove them forward, fearlessly. Minutes to midnight. 2 blocks from the warehouse, agents settled into position. Surveillance drones hovered silently overhead, sending live feeds to Monroe and her team. The building, a crumbling relic of the city's industrial past, appeared deceptively lifeless. To the untrained eye, it was just another forgotten space in a forgotten part of town. But through the drone footage, Monroe's team spotted flickers of movement, shadows passing behind broken windows, faint glimmers of light from within. They had them. Monroe issued her final orders. "Unit Alpha, take the east entrance. Unit Bravo, secure the rear. SWAT circles the perimeter. No one gets out," she said, her voice unshakable. The tension in the air was electrifying. Guns were checked, flash grenades prepped, and entry points marked. Night vision goggles slid into place, painting the crumbling structure in ghostly shades of green. At 2:47 a.m., Monroe gave the nod. It was time to move. The initial breach. The operation began with a deafening explosion of light and sound as flashbang grenades shattered the heavy silence. The devices, designed to disorient and temporarily blind, created chaos inside the warehouse. A cacophony of yells erupted, followed by heavy footfalls as agents stormed in from all sides. The kidnappers, caught off guard by the speed and ferocity of the breach, scrambled to defend themselves. Vince, the ruthless mastermind of the operation, pulled a handgun and fired blindly toward the east entrance. His accomplices, equally desperate, overturned crates and equipment in a feeble attempt to create barriers. But the FBI was prepared for a fight. SWAT officers moved like a well-oiled machine, their movements synchronized and deliberate. Shots rang out, echoing off the walls like thunder in a storm. Metal clashed against concrete as the criminals tried to push back, but they were hopelessly outgunned and outmatched. Monroe stayed just outside the perimeter, commanding the operation with sharp, calculated precision. "Cover the north exit!" she barked into her radio. "No one gets through! I want Vince alive! He's the key to unraveling their entire network." Sophie's prison. Amid the chaos of the gunfire and flashing lights, Sophie sat chained in a corner, her body frail and her mind teetering on the edge of collapse. The cold concrete beneath her hadn't shifted in days. She didn't even flinch when the explosions began. Too weak to cry, too drained to scream, she focused on the small things, like the faint hum of the fluorescent light bulbs or the crack in the wall she'd been staring at for hours. Her captors had reminded her daily that no one was coming. "Your daddy's money doesn't mean anything now," they'd sneered. Their hands had left bruises on her arms, their words had battered her soul. But then, something changed. The thunder of explosives and the sharp, commanding voices of agents crashed through the monotony of her captivity. Hope, fragile yet undeniable, flickered inside her. She began to cry, her tears washing down her gaunt cheeks as she mustered her last ounce of strength to yell, "I'm here! Help me!" Rescuing Sophie. It was Agent Monroe herself who reached Sophie's prison door. Guided by the layout they had pieced together from surveillance footage, Monroe knew exactly where to find her. The door was locked, but a single round from Monroe's handgun sent the rusted hinges bursting apart. There she was. Sophie's frail frame was nearly unrecognizable. Her wrists, raw and bruised, were bound with zip ties. Her legs trembled as she tried to stand, a reflex barely remembered after days of immobility. Monroe rushed to her, immediately slicing through her restraints with a small knife. "You're safe now," Monroe whispered, her voice steady despite the lump forming in her throat. "We've got you." Sophie collapsed into Monroe's arms, her body trembling with relief and fear. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Sophie allowed herself to believe the nightmare was over. The final stand. Meanwhile, back in the main section of the warehouse, Vince was making his last stand. Backed into a corner, his gun empty, he grabbed a metal pipe and swung wildly at the approaching SWAT officers, but his resistance was short-lived. A precise blow from a stun baton dropped him to his knees, where he was promptly handcuffed by two agents. "You'll never stop us," Vince spat as he was dragged away. But the agents didn't respond. His empire of fear and greed had crumbled, and his words carried no power here. With the building secured and the kidnappers detained, Monroe gave the all-clear signal. "Mission accomplished," she said, though the weight of the ordeal was unmistakable in her voice. The aftermath. Sophie was rushed to a nearby hospital where doctors worked tirelessly to treat her dehydration, malnutrition, and minor injuries. Henry Reeves arrived as soon as he got the call, embracing his daughter with the kind of ferocity only a parent could understand. "I thought I'd lost you," Henry whispered, his tears soaking into Sophie's hair. Monroe watched from a distance, allowing herself a rare moment of emotional reflection. The sight of Sophie safe in her father's arms reminded her why she had chosen a career so steeped in danger and sacrifice. For Sophie, the road to recovery would be long and daunting. But she had survived hell, and with the unyielding love of her family, she would find her way back to herself. As for Monroe and her team, they left the operation with a sense of pride, but also a renewed understanding of the fragility of life and the urgency of their mission to protect it. The tragedy in Texas. Emily's marriage from hell. Emily Daniels grew up in a small Texas town where neighbors knew one another's names and life moved at a slow, predictable pace. She was an optimistic young woman with a passion for creativity. She painted, baked, and dreamed of one day running her own small business. At 22, Emily was vibrant and full of life, the type of person others gravitated toward for her kindness and infectious smile. When Emily met Anthony Green, a man with slick charm and the confidence of someone who always got what he wanted, it felt like an unexpected fairy tale. Though Anthony was 10 years her senior, his maturity and sophistication seemed to offer everything Emily thought she lacked in her own life. He was attentive, thoughtful, and knew just how to make Emily feel special. He brought her roses on their third date, whispered promises of adventure, and spoke about building a family together. To her, he felt like destiny. Her parents were cautious, not because Anthony wasn't polite, but because they sensed something off in his intensity. He seemed possessive even in small ways, choosing her meals for her at dinner, cutting into conversations to speak for her, and answering questions directed at Emily as if she couldn't speak for herself. "Are you sure about him?" her mother had asked tentatively one evening. Emily brushed her concerns aside. "He's just protective," she replied. "I've never had someone care for me like this." 6 months later they were engaged. Within a year, they were married. Emily, glowing in her white dress, stood in front of her family with so much hope for her future. But only weeks after their wedding, that glow began to dim. The first red flags. Anthony's demeanor began to shift almost immediately after the honeymoon ended. The man who had once opened car doors for her and hung on her every word was now curt and dismissive. His controlling tendencies, which Emily had mistaken for concern during their courtship, began to show their true colors. It started small, comments about her appearance, criticisms that felt like advice. "Are you really going to wear that dress?" he'd say, the charm from his voice replaced by a sharp edge. "Remember, people judge a man by the way his wife looks." Soon, his comments became commands. He told her what to wear, how to style her hair, and even how to smile when they went to church or gatherings. Behind closed doors, Anthony's criticisms escalated to verbal abuse. "You're useless without me," he spat one night after Emily accidentally burned a casserole. "God, what did I marry you for?" Emily began to walk on eggshells, trying to avoid his wrath. She stopped seeing her family as much, partly because Anthony discouraged it and partly because she didn't know how to explain the tension simmering in her new home. Isolation and control. Anthony's control tactics grew more sinister over time. He began monitoring her phone calls, insisting she answer on speaker or in front of him. If she received a text, he demanded to see it. He installed cameras in their home under the guise of safety, but Emily quickly realized they were meant to surveil her every move. "Just so I know you're safe," he'd say before leaving for work, the words laced with a patronizing undertone. In truth, the cameras stripped Emily of every ounce of privacy. By the time they moved into Anthony's family home, a sprawling ranch house outside San Antonio, Emily's contact with the outside world had all but disappeared. Any visit with her parents required Anthony's approval, and even then, the visits were rare, rushed, and under his close oversight. Slowly but surely, Emily's world shrank until it was just her, Anthony, and the cold walls of the life he'd built to cage her. The abuse turns physical. Anthony's temper flared without warning. At first it was loud words and slammed doors, but words turned into shoves and shoves turned into punches. The first time he struck her, Emily had burned his dinner again. She apologized until her voice cracked, but Anthony answered with an open hand across her face. "You need to learn to listen," he said calmly, as if lecturing a child. Emily was too stunned to cry. By the time she worked up the courage to confront him the next morning, he dismissed it as a one-time loss of control. "You made me angry," he said. "Let's not make a habit of it." But it wasn't a one-time incident. The abuse became routine, a shove into a wall when she spoke too loudly, a bruise on her arm from his punishing grip when she asked too many questions. If she resisted or begged him to stop, he'd explode in rage. "You think you can leave me?" he screamed one night, pinning her against the kitchen counter. "No one will love you like I do. You'd be nothing without me." The family dynamic, a living hell. When Anthony's parents moved in, Emily thought it might improve her situation. She believed they might intervene or at the very least serve as witnesses to his behavior. But Anthony's father, Richard, was cut from the same cloth, demanding and domineering. Instead of helping Emily, Richard encouraged Anthony's cruelty. If she failed to meet their rigid expectations, cleaning, cooking, or maintaining the house to their impossible standards, Richard would berate her in front of Anthony, who often responded by punishing her later. "Emily, you should be grateful you married into this family," Richard told her one evening, glaring at her over the dinner table. "If I were Anthony, I wouldn't tolerate this kind of laziness." Anthony's mother Olivia was no better. Though quieter than her husband, her disapproving glances and icy comments reinforced Emily's isolation. "Women like you are lucky to have men like my son," she sneered. Emily worked from dawn to dusk, scrubbing floors, preparing meals, and enduring daily ridicule, yet no matter how hard she tried, it was never enough. A silent cry for help, Emily's hope dwindled with each passing day. The once vibrant young woman who had dreamed of a life full of love and possibility was fading into a shadow of herself. Her face, once bright and warm, now looked hollow and weary. The bruises on her arms, legs and ribs she hid beneath long sleeves and careful smiles. When her mother called for the first time in weeks and asked if she was okay, Emily's voice cracked. "I'm fine," she whispered, her lie heavy with pain. After hanging up, she cried silently into her pillow, wondering if anyone would ever suspect the truth. The breaking point. 2 years into her marriage, Emily reached her breaking point. On a sweltering summer afternoon, Anthony, enraged by what he called her insubordination, struck her harder than ever before. Emily hit the ground, her vision blurred, and she didn't rise for several minutes. It was then that she realized she wouldn't survive much longer, not if things stayed the way they were. But escaping wasn't an option. Anthony had cut off her finances, monitored her whereabouts, and made it clear that if she ever tried to leave, he'd find her. "You can't run from me," he had said darkly. "You belong to me, Emily." A tragedy unfolds. Emily's story ended in heartbreak. One fateful night, after a particularly horrifying incident of abuse, Emily's body couldn't take the pain anymore. She passed away in the very home she had been trapped in, her life stolen by the man who claimed to love her. Her death shocked the community. Friends and neighbors had seen her less and less over the years, but never imagined the nightmare she'd been living. When the news broke, it left a collective sense of guilt. How could no one have noticed? Could they have saved her? A community changed forever. Emily's case became a rallying cry across Texas for stronger protections against domestic abuse. Her tragic story shed light on the dangers of isolation and control, sparking conversations that had long been avoided. But for her family, the pain of losing Emily was immeasurable. The dreams they'd all shared for her, a career, a family, a life full of color, were reduced to ashes. Emily's legacy, however, endures. A painful reminder of the urgency to recognize the signs of abuse before it's too late. The Hidden Darkness, Emily's life of abuse, ending in tragedy. The story of Emily Daniels is not an unfamiliar one, yet it resonates with a profound, gut-wrenching sadness that feels unbearable with each retelling. To the outside world, Emily's life in suburban Texas seemed picture-perfect. She had all the makings of a happy life. A young, beautiful woman in her early 20s, newly married, and a home with her husband, Anthony Green, that outwardly represented stability. But behind the facade of dinners with neighbors and polite church smiles, Emily was crumbling under the weight of a monstrous secret. Emily was a woman trapped, isolated, and silenced. Her home, which should have been her sanctuary, became a prison, a place where every corner bore witness to unspeakable suffering. It was there, behind walls that shielded her abuser from judgment, that Emily endured unspeakable physical, emotional, and psychological torture, and it was there that her light was ultimately extinguished by the man she once called her partner, Anthony. The physical nightmare, a woman's body as a battlefield. Emily's abuse began in seemingly small but intentional ways, gripping her arm too hard during an argument, a shove during a heated conversation, or a slap disguised as a loss of temper. These instances, Anthony assured her, were her fault. "You made me do it," he would say, his tone as calm as if discussing the weather. At first, Emily tried to rationalize it. Maybe it really was her fault. Maybe she shouldn't have questioned him when he came home late, or maybe the dinner she made really wasn't good enough. Anthony skillfully wove these thoughts into her mind, planting seeds of doubt and guilt that grew rampant over time. But his temper only escalated, turning these fleeting acts of aggression into relentless violence. Within weeks, her slender arms were littered with bruises she hastily covered with long sleeves. Her ribs bore the marks of countless kicks, and her lips split so often that she learned to apply makeup flawlessly to conceal it. Anthony didn't just hit her, he ensured she felt every ounce of his strength. He shoved her into walls, slammed her delicate body onto cold floors, and in his most enraged moments, strangled her just enough to hear her gasping for air before letting go. "Do you understand now?" he'd ask after each episode, his voice eerily steady. "This happens because you don't listen." Her world revolved around trying not to provoke him, though nothing she did was ever right in his eyes. The more she complied, the more inventive he became in asserting his dominance. He'd whip household objects at her, plates, books, anything within arm's reach, just to remind her who held the power. The emotional wounds that cut deeper. The bruises on her skin healed with time, but the scars Anthony left on Emily's mind only deepened. His words were like daggers, designed not to wound her temporarily, but to dismantle her very sense of self. "You're worthless without me," he often sneered. "Tell me, who else would ever want a broken thing like you?" Anthony would isolate her further with threats carefully crafted to break her will. If she ever dared to leave him, he said, no one would believe her. He was well liked in the community, a charming, articulate man who attended church and helped at fundraisers. Emily, on the other hand, had been carefully painted as unstable and weak in the eyes of her neighbors. "She's a little emotional sometimes," Anthony would joke when Emily seemed quiet at church gatherings. Emily's entire support system crumbled under the weight of his control. Friends stopped calling because Anthony made excuses for her absence, telling them she was too stressed or that she needed to focus on their marriage. Even her family visits dwindled, as Anthony monitored her interactions and made it clear that disloyalty to him would come with consequences. Starved of hope, starved of life. By the time Emily reached her mid-20s, she was a shell of the bright, spirited young woman she once was. Even basic needs like food and rest were weaponized against her. Anthony would withhold meals as punishment if the house wasn't spotless or if she dared speak back to him. Some days she was lucky to drink just enough water to keep herself going. Her thin frame grew weaker, her once luminous cheeks hollowed into something sharp and angular. The woman who used to dance barefoot in the kitchen to country music now moved silently, her footsteps soft like a ghost lingering in her own home. At night, Emily lay awake in bed, her body trembling from exhaustion but her mind too tormented to rest. She feared what tomorrow would bring, but she feared the alternatives even more. Anthony had promised her time and time again that if she ever tried to run, the consequences would be devastating, not just for her, but for her family. "I know where your parents live," he would say with a dark smirk. "Don't make me teach them a lesson too." That was the evil of Anthony. He didn't just break Emily, he made her believe that leaving wasn't survival, but an invitation for even greater suffering. The night it all ended. The night Emily's life came to its tragic conclusion was marked by a terrifying crescendo of rage. It began with something as trivial as a missed phone call. Anthony had returned from work in one of his moods, his anger simmering just below the surface like a volcano about to erupt. "Why didn't you answer, Emily?" he demanded, his voice laced with venom. Before she could respond, his hands were on her. It wasn't the first time Emily had felt his fury, but this time was different. The violence was unrelenting, the blows harsher and more calculated, as though Anthony wanted to erase every trace of the person she used to be. He threw her against the dining table so hard that the wood cracked beneath her weight. Her ribs couldn't take the abuse any longer and she collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath and barely able to move. This was what broke her body, but what ultimately shattered her spirit was that no one came. No neighbors called for help, no one banged on the door to interrupt the nightmare unfolding inside. The world outside carried on, while Emily's world ended in silence. A community awakened too late. When Emily's death was revealed the next day, her small Texas community was shaken to its core. Friends and neighbors who had turned a blind eye to her plight felt the weight of their complicity. How could they not have noticed the fractured smiles, the hurried conversations, the way Emily's once bright eyes seemed dimmer every time they spoke? Her story became a bitter reckoning, sparking uncomfortable conversations around kitchen tables and at church meetings. For many, Emily wasn't just the victim of one man's cruelty, she was the victim of a collective failure to watch, listen, and act. Her legacy and tragedy. After Anthony's trial, where his cold, remorseless demeanor shocked even seasoned lawyers, Emily's family fought to honor her memory by advocating for change. They organized memorials, fought for tougher domestic abuse laws, and worked to break the silence that had enabled Emily's public and private suffering. But no amount of activism could bring her back, and for her parents, the hole left in their hearts could never truly be filled. They mourned not only for the daughter they lost, but the lifetimes she would never live, the children she would never have, the passion she would never realize, the simple joys stolen from her by a man who claimed to love her. Emily Daniels became a name spoken in whispers across Texas, a story mothers told their daughters as a warning, and women carried in their hearts as a rallying cry. No one should ever endure what she endured. A reminder of responsibility. Emily's death left an indelible scar on those who heard it. It forced people to confront uncomfortable truths about the hidden corners of domestic life and ask themselves one haunting question: would I have noticed? The law intervenes and public outrage. The news of Emily Daniels' death spread like wildfire across Texas and beyond. It began with somber whispers in her hometown's quaint community, where friends and neighbors quietly mourned the tragic loss of a life cut far too short. But as the details of her abuse emerged, those whispers grew to cries, and those cries amplified into an uproar that echoed across TV screens, social media platforms, and the hearts of a nation that couldn't fathom how anyone could be subjected to such cruelty in silence. Anthony Green, Emily's husband, was arrested the morning after her lifeless body was discovered. The crime scene, a beautifully maintained suburban home with a white picket fence, had transformed overnight from a picturesque family dwelling into a house of horrors. Inside, the walls bore the silent testimony of years of violence. Small bloodstains on the carpet, dents in the drywall, and broken furniture that hinted at countless unseen battles. Although Anthony maintained a cold indifference during his arrest, the evidence against him was staggering. Police reports detailed the bruising on Emily's body, the scarring from older injuries, and the clear signs of prolonged physical and emotional torment. Her friends and family, long cut off from her life by Anthony's manipulation, came forward to share unsettling anecdotes, stories of isolation, withdrawn communication, and unspoken cries for help that, at the time, they hadn't fully understood. The small Texas community was jolted awake, grappling with guilt for not intervening sooner, and anger toward a system that had allowed Emily's suffering to continue unchecked. Questions loomed. How had she fallen through the cracks? Why hadn't someone stepped in to protect her? And most chillingly, how many other individuals were suffering in silence just like Emily? A trial that held the nation's attention. As Anthony's trial began, the media descended like vultures, shining a glaring light on the tragedy, not only on the abuse endured by Emily, but also on the failures of society at large. Every newspaper carried her smiling wedding photo juxtaposed with headlines detailing her horrific demise. News anchors spoke of a beautiful young woman living a nightmare behind closed doors, as photos of Emily filled television screens across the country. The courtroom was packed with reporters, activists, and members of the community, all eager to see justice served. Anthony, dressed in a charcoal gray suit, appeared emotionless, his face betraying no remorse as the prosecution detailed the years of brutality he inflicted on Emily. The evidence presented was harrowing. Witnesses described the drastic changes in Emily after her marriage, her once vibrant laugh replaced by quiet avoidance, her decreasing visits to friends and family, and her visible weight loss and hidden bruises. A forensic team uncovered journal entries Emily had hidden, documenting the abuse she suffered and the fears that paralyzed her into submission. "I'm scared of him," one entry read, "but I'm even more scared of what might happen if I try to leave." The most damning testimony came from Emily's autopsy report, which revealed the extent of the injuries she sustained the night Anthony ended her life. Her broken ribs told the story of a calculated attack. The bruises on her wrists and neck highlighted an escalation of violence that had become routine. Under the courtroom's harsh fluorescent lights, the narrative of Emily's final moments came to life in a way that left the audience horrified and enraged. Despite the overwhelming evidence, Anthony's defense team leaned into tactics that infuriated the public and left Emily's supporters stunned. They argued that Anthony's acts were the result of temporary emotional instability and sought to portray him as a stressed and overworked husband who snapped. Their strategy bordered on victim blaming, suggesting that Emily's struggles, painted as emotional dependency and mental fragility, had contributed to the instability in their home. The courtroom gasped as the defense argued that Anthony's behavior was not premeditated, but an unfortunate consequence of a strained marriage and poor communication. Activists watching the trial took to social media to protest, demanding accountability for a system that frequently allowed abusers to escape harsh sentences. A nation erupts in outrage. The trial became more than just a legal proceeding. It became a national conversation about domestic abuse, power dynamics, and the failure of institutions to protect vulnerable individuals like Emily. Across the country, protests and candlelight vigils in Emily's honor took place, her name etched onto posters alongside slogans like "Justice for Emily" and "Stop the Silence." Social media platforms buzzed with anger as hashtags like #JusticeForEmily and #EndDomesticViolence began trending. Survivors of abuse shared their own stories under these hashtags, creating a sobering mosaic of voices that had been silenced for far too long. "Emily's story is my story," one woman wrote on Twitter. "We can't let this happen again." Advocates argued that Emily's case wasn't an isolated tragedy but part of a broader epidemic of domestic violence. Statistics resurfaced, shining a harsh light on the number of women and men trapped in abusive relationships every year. Lawmakers and activists seized the moment to push for reforms, calling for stronger protections for survivors, increased funding for shelters, and harsher punishments for abusers. The case had become a flashpoint for national reckoning, forcing America to confront its own complicity in ignoring the quiet, insidious violence that happens behind closed doors. The verdict and the public divide. After weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read. Guilty, but not for first-degree murder. Instead, the jury settled on a lesser charge, manslaughter. The sentence, 20 years in prison. The reaction was immediate and explosive. For Emily's grieving family, the verdict was a gut punch. Outside the courthouse, supporters wailed in disbelief, holding signs that read, 20 years for a lifetime of suffering, and is this justice? The verdict reignited public debates about how domestic abusers were prosecuted. Activists argued that the legal system so often viewed cases like Emily's as individual failures rather than symptoms of systemic inadequacies. Had Emily reported Anthony to law enforcement earlier, and much more importantly, had the system offered her tangible protection, she might still be alive. Critics of the verdict called for reform in how perpetrators of domestic violence were sentenced. 20 years for Anthony, they argued, was insufficient given the years of torment he inflicted on Emily and the life he ultimately stole from her. A call to action. In the aftermath, Emily's parents turned their grief into advocacy. They founded the Emily Daniels Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting survivors of abuse and lobbying for stricter domestic violence laws. Through public appearances, interviews, and partnerships with national organizations, they worked tirelessly to ensure that Emily's story would leave behind a lasting legacy. The foundation helped push for Emily's Law, a proposed bill that would impose harsher penalties on domestic abusers and increase funding for crisis hotlines and shelters. It also aimed to establish mandatory training for law enforcement officers to better recognize and respond to signs of abuse. Emily's voice was silenced, but we won't stop speaking for her, her mother said during a rally in Austin, her voice trembling but resolute. A lesson for society. Emily Daniels' story became a cautionary tale, a brutal reminder of the hidden corners of societal failure. It forced Americans to reflect on what they would do if they saw the signs of abuse. Would they intervene, or would they turn a blind eye until it was too late? Reflection. Justice for victims and painful lessons. In the aftermath of Emily Daniels' death and the harrowing revelations of her life, a profound stillness settled over her Texas community, a silence heavy with guilt, grief, and reflection. For those who had known her, even casually, the knowledge of her suffering haunted them. Every moment of shared laughter, every wave from across church pews, every glance that could have caught the hidden bruises, these were suddenly imbued with a heartbreaking question. Could I have done something to save her? The story of Emily's abuse and tragic end spread far beyond the confines of her small town. It resonated deeply with people across the state and the nation, forcing uncomfortable yet necessary conversations about domestic violence, societal neglect, and the often overlooked vulnerability of victims. What assurances do we offer the Emilys among us? What does justice look like, not just for those who have been lost, but for those suffering right now? The answers to these questions were neither simple nor comforting. The fragile nature of victims' agency. Emily's story illuminated a dark truth about abuse, the way it corrodes its victims from the inside out. Anthony Green didn't just wield physical power over Emily, he controlled her every thought, robbed her of independence, and made her complicit in the walls of silence that surrounded her. Abusers know how to systematically dismantle their victims' autonomy. They isolate them, ensuring their cries for help are muffled or lost entirely. In Emily's case, Anthony's clever manipulation placed her at odds with herself. She was caught between the hope of escape and the fear he had so completely planted in her. Fear for herself, fear for her family, fear of being blamed or disbelieved. Her journal entries, discovered during Anthony's trial, spoke volumes about the psychological warfare she endured daily. I told myself today that I should just be grateful, but it's getting harder to believe that. He says he loves me, but if this is love, why am I so scared all the time? Every time I think about leaving, I hear his voice in my head. You're nothing without me. Maybe he's right. Emily's reflections were a mirror to countless silent victims across the nation, trapped not just by their abusive partners but by a society quick to ask, why didn't she just leave? No one could comprehend the nuanced terror of leaving when every step outside the door feels like walking into the unknown with no safety net to catch the fall. Justice, a complex concept. But justice, many asked, Was the 20-year sentence handed to Anthony Green enough? For Emily's parents, friends, and advocates, the answer was an unequivocal no. Anthony had stolen more than a life. He had extinguished a bright, vibrant future. Emily never got the opportunity to live out her passions. She would never enjoy a peaceful, loving marriage, share the laughter of children around a dinner table, or watch the Texas sunsets from a backyard filled with warmth and joy. 20 years was a prison sentence that felt far too temporary to atone for the permanence of Emily's absence. True justice, as many argued, wasn't simply about punishing Anthony. It was about ensuring that no other abuser could follow in his footsteps. It was about creating a system so strong, so vigilant, that people like Emily wouldn't slip through its cracks in the first place. During court proceedings, Emily's parents wept openly. Her mother, when asked to speak, delivered a powerful statement that resonated beyond the courtroom. "My daughter won't see another sunrise, she won't get another chance to dream, and I won't get another chance to tell her that none of this was her fault. No sentence can ever give her back to us. The only justice now is making sure no one else lives this nightmare." A society confronts itself. Emily's tragedy wasn't just an individual failure, it was a systemic one. The people closest to her, friends, churchgoers, neighbors, failed to recognize the telltale signs of abuse and didn't know how to intervene. Likewise, the larger societal structure failed her, making resources hard to access, protection too temporary, and victims too afraid to speak out. Police officers, domestic violence counselors, and even lawyers testified after the trial that cases like Emily's weren't rare. The only difference was that her story had reached a tragic public conclusion. They revealed staggering figures. 1 in 4 women in the U.S. experience intimate partner violence at some point in their lives. On average, a victim tries to leave 7 times before they're successful or before their chance runs out. In many cases, abusers exert such psychological dominance over their victims that they don't seek help, believing no one will hear them, or worse, blaming themselves for the abuse. For many in the community, Emily's death became a wake-up call. Townspeople who had once dismissed meddling in private affairs began reconsidering their silence. Neighbors pledged to speak up if they ever suspected abuse again. Pastors, teachers, and women's groups organized local talks about recognizing warning signs and offering victims safe spaces to confide. At the state level, Emily's death set off a firestorm of activism. Campaigns for stronger domestic violence legislation gained renewed momentum. Activists called for the passage of Emily's Law, which proposed mandatory felony charges for repeat abusers, increased funding for victim support services, and training programs for law enforcement to ensure that abuse allegations weren't dismissed as domestic disputes. Painful lessons and collective responsibility. There is no undoing what happened to Emily Daniels. Every conversation inspired by her story came with the bitter aftertaste of knowing it was too late for her. And yet, the lessons her life and death imparted carried the promise of sparing others from her fate. Her name became a rallying cry for accountability, not just within the legal system but within the hearts and minds of everyday people. Emily's story reminded society of something fundamental. Domestic abuse isn't only the victim's burden to bear, it's a collective responsibility. When a neighbor hears the raised voice and the slam of a door, when a friend notices the avoidance and strange excuses, when a family member senses something isn't right, these moments define whether someone like Emily is saved or left behind. Towards a compassionate future. Justice for Emily, then, was never about Anthony's trial alone. It was about creating a shift in how society supports its most vulnerable members. From the bird's eye view, it meant reforms, resources, and legislation. But on the ground level, it meant something simpler. Pay attention. Speak up. Believe someone when they say they're scared. Justice for Emily is mothers having conversations with their daughters about recognizing toxic relationships early. It's neighbors asking, "Are you okay?" when someone looks a little too worn down. It's schools and workplaces implementing policies and training to support people in abusive situations. The hard truth is that Emily's suffering will never be erased, nor will the scars she left on her loved ones fade entirely. Her parents will always ache for the little girl they raised, and her friends will always live with the memory of the bright young woman they lost. But her tragedy doesn't have to be meaningless. As Emily's mother said at a candlelight vigil, "My daughter didn't get to tell her story, but her story will help everyone else understand what they need to do." Don't walk past someone who looks like they need help. Don't think it's not your place to ask if something is wrong. If Emily's story stops one more person from suffering the way she did, then we'll know her pain wasn't in vain. The endless fight for justice. Emily Daniels became more than a victim. She became a symbol for every woman, man, and child enduring the unthinkable in silence. Her story lingers as a painful reminder that justice isn't just about catching the abuser, it's about preventing the abuse from happening in the first place. The fight for justice is unending. It's found in every hotline call, every protective law passed, every whispered "thank you for helping me." And when the world feels impossibly broken, remembering Emily's legacy, that even in the darkness we have the power to shield, to shelter, and to save, remains the beacon guiding the way toward a better, safer future. Conclusion: toward a just and humane society. The story of Emily Daniels is deeply unsettling, not only because of the raw tragedy of her life, but because her suffering reveals how much work remains to be done in the fight for justice, equality, and compassion. Her life, and her death, forces us to confront a series of unanswered questions. What kind of world do we want to live in? What values do we choose to uphold? How do we protect the vulnerable among us? And how do we hold ourselves accountable when we fail them? To most people in her small Texas town, Emily's life seemed to be one of comfort, stability, and love. The white picket fences, the church socials, the faint traces of laughter heard once upon a time from her family's home, all painted a rosy image of happiness. It was an illusion that tragically proved to be just that. Beneath the surface, Emily's life was torn apart by the insidious evil of intimate partner violence, compounded by the suffocating silence that cloaked her suffering. What happened to Emily is a failure on every level. A betrayal of human decency, a breakdown of societal responsibility, and ultimately, a world unwilling to speak up when the weight of one woman's pain could have been shared. We cannot change the ending of Emily's story, but her legacy gives us the power to rewrite the narrative for others. Her story begs us, challenges us, to create a society that values human dignity, fosters empathy, and establishes systems strong enough to ensure no one ever suffers alone. A society's call to responsibility. At its core, Emily's story is about more than domestic abuse. It's about the collective responsibility we all share to check on each other, protect one another, and advocate for those who have had their voices stolen. Imagine a community where Emily's cries for help didn't go unheard, a society where her neighbors leaned in closer when they noticed the dark circles under her eyes, or began to wonder why she no longer joined them for Sunday barbecues. Imagine friends who knew how to ask the right questions, or a justice system equipped with the tools and the urgency to see every Emily for who she is, not invisible, not trapped, but a person deserving of freedom, safety, and hope. The truth is that no one person failed Emily. It wasn't just Anthony's violent actions, it was the silence of neighbors who hesitated to interfere, the legal system that lacked the resources to intervene earlier, and the normalized culture of looking away from someone else's pain because it's none of our business. The first step toward a more humane society, then, is the willingness to break the silence. For every time someone hears the muffled shouting of an argument next door, for every moment we feel uneasy about a colleague who recoils at physical touch, for every time we see a friend withdraw into isolation, the choice to act or not to act could become the turning point in someone's story. Justice begins not in the courtroom, but in the everyday decisions we make to care for one another, reforming institutions, reshaping culture. While individual compassion is critical, Emily's story also underscores the urgent need for institutional reform. Too often, the systems designed to protect people like Emily fail them, whether it's inadequate enforcement of restraining orders, underfunded shelters for abuse survivors, or a lack of mandatory education on recognizing the signs of abuse. In Emily's honor, activists and lawmakers have begun to demand progress. Proposals like Emily's Law aim to make meaningful strides by increasing funding for domestic violence shelters, extending protection for restraining orders, and imposing stricter penalties on serial abusers. These reforms aren't just bureaucratic adjustments, they are lifelines for those who feel like no one is coming to save them. The law must also confront the psychological grip abusers hold over their victims. It's not enough to reduce domestic violence to numbers in a report, or to hear survivors say, "I felt trapped." Courts must handle these cases with sensitivity, acknowledging that abuse doesn't begin with the first slap, or end with the filing of a police report. Abuse is a cycle that must be broken, not by the victim alone but by a coordinated effort involving friends, family, legal advocates, and community leaders. Schools, workplaces, and community organizations also have a role to play. Education is the bedrock of prevention. Imagine high schools teaching young people about healthy relationships before they ever enter one. Imagine companies dedicating resources to support employees who may be experiencing violence or control at home. Imagine churches and mosques creating outreach programs that provide confidential spaces for victims to seek help. None of this is easy, but it is necessary. Change comes not from grand gestures but from countless small acts of courage and connection. Fostering empathy, building humanity. Perhaps the simplest yet most powerful way to honor Emily's memory is to foster empathy. If we hope to build a world where stories like hers become rare, or dare we dream, non-existent, we must begin with the ways we see and treat each other. Empathy doesn't require grand gestures. It's found in the quiet moments when someone takes the time to ask, "How are you doing?" and waits to hear the real answer. It's in the courage to offer a hand or a listening ear, even when we might not have the perfect words to say. It's in sitting with someone's fear, pain, or shame without judgment. Emily's story teaches us that building a humane society isn't about solving every problem overnight. It's about creating a culture where people feel safe to share their struggles and confident that they'll be met with support rather than skepticism. No one should ever feel invisible, especially not in their darkest moments. Toward lasting change. There is no undoing the pain Emily endured or the grief her family lives with now. Her laughter will never echo again, her art will never hang in galleries, and her dreams will never come true. But her death can still have meaning if it pushes society to confront its failings and do better. Creating a just and humane society isn't about aiming for perfection, it's about making progress. It's about building systems and cultural norms that leave no room for cruelty, exploitation, or neglect. It's about ensuring that the next time someone like Emily cries out in silence, there are hands reaching out to pull her to safety. A future worth protecting. Emily Daniels' life, though tragically short, can serve as a turning point if we let it. Her story calls on every one of us to do better, not just for victims of domestic abuse but for anyone who feels unheard, unseen, or unloved in their time of need. Toward a more just and humane society, the path is clear. Speak up, listen closely, offer support, be present. It's a long road forward, but with every voice raised, every law passed, and every life saved, we get a little closer to the kind of compassionate world Emily deserved to live in. Let Emily's memory guide us, and let her legacy remind us of the question we must all answer in the quiet moments when someone's life might depend on what we do next. What kind of world are we fighting for?